Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. The book is The World of Philosophy, an introductory reader by Stephen Kahn, the editor. And in this video, we will be going over Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and Kwame Gyekye's article about character in Akan Ethics. So, Kwame Gyekye, whose work we read previously, explains that for the Akan of Ghana, character is the focal point of the ethical life. As in Aristotle's thought, ethics is not a matter of following moral rules, but of developing a virtuous character. Doing so is not innate, but the product of doing good deeds. In other words, the habit of doing what is good results in good character. That's the main lesson for Aristotle and for Gyekye's interpretation of the Akan philosophy of Ghana. All right, and this will be addressing for exam 4. Part A, question 2, what are the similarities and differences between the virtue, character, and care views of ethics in Aristotle, Gyekye, and Held? Which view is better argued, why, and explained? So Held, Virginia Held, and it's the ethics of care. The ethics of care I will discuss in the next video and compare and contrast that to the virtue ethics espoused by Aristotle and the Akan. So let me just, and this will also be covering part B, questions 6 and 7. So how are character and virtue interrelated in Aristotle's account? How does character feature in Akan ethics? So as always, you can develop any kind of an answer you want so long as you support it appropriately with pertinent quotes from the text. There's a lot of freedom for interpretation, but just as long as your interpretation is supported reasonably by the text. So for Aristotle, every time I reteach this class, I remember the first time I read Nicomachean Ethics was my freshman year at college, at Boston College, and a good friend of mine had cut his arm by breaking it. He's bumped into a window and the glass cut his arm. Anyway, I went to the hospital with him, and I sat in the emergency room, waiting room for 3 or 4 hours, and I was just reading this, and it seemed to me one of the most practical pieces of advice I had received. So his main point, Aristotle's main point, which is the same basic main point for the Akan philosophy, is that you develop virtues through habit. You want to be courageous, then do courageous deeds. Stand your ground in the face of fear. You might say, no, what's the point? I'm inherently timid, and I'll never be brave. So sure, I can stand my ground once, but what's the point? I'll never make myself anything but a coward. And Aristotle would say, no, it seems hard and impossible at first, but the more often you exercise those kinds of virtuous behaviors, the more easily you'll do them the next time until they become second nature, and you've developed a well-entrenched habit. So you can develop yourself. It's not that you're born one way and that's what you're stuck with. You can develop all the virtues, or conversely, you can develop all the vices if you behave poorly, but it's in your hands. You have the freedom to become vicious or virtuous through habituating yourself to be that way. All right, so I'm just going to read through a few selections of that, and then we'll move on to character in the Akan ethics. So Aristotle, this is page 342 on the left, every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit is thought to aim at some good, and for this reason the good has rightly been declared to be that at which all things aim. So Aristotle was a student of Plato's. He studied in Plato's academy, and Plato famously had Socrates in the dialogue called the Republic say that the ultimate goal of self-realization is the idea of the good. That's the source of everything, and that's what everyone ultimately strives for, whether they know it or not. Okay, so continuing here. If then there is some end of the things we do, which we desire for its own sake, everything else being desired for the sake of this, clearly this must be the chief good. Now such a thing, happiness above all else, is held to be. For this we choose always for itself and never for the sake of something else. So you might choose money. You want money. Okay, why do you want money? So that I can buy things. So you want it to help you get other things. What do you want those other things for? Ultimately, Aristotle will say, is you want things so you can be happy. That's the ultimate goal of life. We saw the same opinion expressed by John Stuart Mill. And even Immanuel Kant admitted everybody does want happiness, but that's not the chief good. The chief good for Kant was a good will, which was respect for the idea of the law in general, or what Plato would have called the idea of the good. All right, continuing. Now, such a thing, happiness above all else, is held to be. For this we choose always for itself and never for the sake of something else. Presumably, however, to say that happiness is the chief good seems a platitude, and a clearer account of what it is still desired. This might perhaps be given if we could first ascertain the function of man. So then he'll go on to say, does the flute player have a function, but man in general, the human species, doesn't? Or does the eye have a function, the ear, the nose, and the tongue, but altogether the human doesn't? Oh, we must have a function. Now, those who believe in Darwinian evolution would say, no, there's no inherent function of the human species. Everything emerged randomly. There's no teleological, goal-oriented design inherent in us. Things happen randomly, but Aristotle was aware of that theory. He didn't call Darwinism. For him, it was from Democritus, little bits of matter, combine in an infinite void over an infinite amount of time, and that creates all of the complexity we see. That was a philosophy with which Aristotle was familiar, and he rejected it. He believed that things have a function. Well, what is the function of a human being? What then can this be? Life seems to belong even to plants. It can't be living. Sure, we're alive, so are plants. So they can't be our uniquely human function. Next, there would be a life of perception. But you know what? The ox and every animal can also perceive, see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. So that can't be the ultimate, definitively human function. There remains then an active life of the element that has a rational principle. Now, if the function of man is an activity of soul, which follows or implies a rational principle, and if any action is well performed when it is performed in accordance with the appropriate excellence, human good turns out to be activity of soul exhibiting excellence. All right, the function of a human being is to use reason. That's what differentiates us from all other living forms. Virtue, then, being of two kinds, intellectual and moral, intellectual virtue in the main owes both its birth and its growth to teaching, for which reason it requires experience and time, while moral virtue comes about as a result of habit. Okay, so you want to be happy, find the function of a human. What's the function of a human? To act according to the excellence of the soul in a human, which is reason. So what does reason tell us that we need to do? Reason tells us we want to be happy. Let's achieve happiness by exercising our reason. All right, and how can a human exercise reason most practically in life? By realizing that you can develop virtues through habit. And similarly, that by realizing that you can develop vices through habit. And then he'll go on to say, moreover, how do you find a virtuous, what is a virtuous action? It's the intermediate, the golden mean between two extremes, one of deficiency and one of excess. He'll go on to say, for example, cowardice is the deficiency of the virtue courage, and rashness is the excess of the virtue courage. And that human reason can discern the virtue of courage by realizing don't be a coward, but don't be a lunatic who just rushes headlong into battle without thinking things through. So continuing here in 343 in the left-hand column, from this it is also plain that none of the moral virtues arises in us by nature, for nothing that exists by nature can form a habit contrary to its nature. You can't habituate a stone to fall upwards. He said it's the nature of stones to move downwards. He didn't understand modern theory of gravity. And you can't habituate fire to go downwards. Fire wants to go up, stones want to go down. No matter how, if you throw a stone up in the air 1,000,000 times, it's not going to form the habit of continuing to go up. So things that you have by nature, you cannot change by habit. The fact that you can change your character through habit means you're not born with it by nature. You're born with the potential to become virtuous or vicious, but you develop virtues or vices through habit. So, this is neither by nature then, nor contrary to nature do the virtues arise in us. Rather, we are adapted by nature to receive them and are made perfect by habit again. Of all the things that come to us by nature, we first acquire the potentiality and later exhibit the activity. This is plain in the case of the senses. For it was not by often seeing or often hearing that we got these senses, but on the contrary, we had them before we used them. But the virtues we get first by exercising them, as also happens in the case of the arts as well. You want to be a good flute player? Play the flute. And the more often you practice, the better flute player you will be. Your eyes work with or without practice. You open your eyes and they work. So that you have vision by nature. I mean, your eyes have to develop from a little baby, naturally they will develop, but it's not through habituating yourself to see that you learn to see. But it is through habituating yourself to play the piano that you become a good piano player, and it's through habituating yourself to be virtuous that you become virtuous. It makes no small difference then whether we form habits of one kind or another from our youth. It makes a very great difference, or rather all the difference. All right, so why shouldn't you steal? All right, let's say you're a college student, you're in the bookstore. Now, college tuition is very expensive. Not at the College of Southern Maryland, but, some other colleges, is an exorbitant fee. And now they want you to buy these textbooks, which are very expensive as well. And that is the case at the College of Southern Maryland and everywhere else. All right, here's a book. Oh, let me just steal the book. No one's looking, I can get away with it. If no one catches me doing it, it's as if I didn't do it at all. Aristotle would say, no, you're forming a vice. That's the beginning. You do it once, you're going to be more inclined to do it again. And if you do it often enough, then you'll have an entrenched vice. And the point is, what do you want to be? Ultimately, you want to be happy. And what does happiness entail? Acting according to our specific function well. What's the specific function of a human? Acting reasonably. And reason tells you that your actions should be virtuous, that if you act viciously, you're going to be unhappy. Even if no one knows you're a thief, you've developed this character of a thief, and that's going to make you unhappy. So for your own happiness, you should resist temptations like stealing, committing adultery, all these kinds of activities that have been called sinful by religions. And it's not necessarily for any moral reason to benefit other people so much as to become happy. You can't be happy if you're vicious. You cannot be happy if you are not virtuous. This is his belief. Others would have, might say, no, that's not the case. I think of The Clockwork Orange, this movie from maybe it was 1970 or the late 60s. At any rate, there's this one guy, Alex, and he's a pathological, cruel person, but he is genuinely vicious, and he derives joy from being vicious. And they try to force him to become good by giving him this drug that makes him sick whenever he thinks of things like rape and murder and robbing people. But ultimately, it's a strange movie that it has you almost rooting for this guy to be able to return to his true nature, which is vicious, and then he's happy when he's vicious. So just to kind of give an opposite perspective, but Aristotle says you cannot be happy if you're not acting reasonably, and you're not reasonable if you don't realize that virtues make you happy and vices make you unhappy. Okay, since then, the present inquiry does not aim at theoretical knowledge like the others, for we are inquiring not in order to know what virtue is, but in order to become good, since otherwise our inquiry would have been of no use. We must examine the nature of actions, namely, how we ought to do them, for these determine also the nature of the states of character that are produced, as we have said. First, then, let us consider this, that it is the nature of such things to be destroyed by defect and excess, as we see in the case of strength and of health. For to gain light on things imperceptible, we must use the evidence of sensible things. The imperceptible thing is your soul. All right, Well, let's look at the body. If you exercise too much, you exhaust yourself. If you don't exercise enough, your muscles atrophy, you become out of shape. If you exercise just enough and eat just the right amount, not too much, not too little, then your body will be healthy. So if you want your soul to be healthy, then you have to exercise the right amount and not too much. Not too much and not too little, like with courage. Too much is rash, too little is cowardice. All right, and since I've said that, that's what he goes on to explain. So I'll skip that paragraph now on page 343 in the right-hand column, second paragraph. But not only are the sources and causes of their origination and growth the same as those of their destruction, but also the sphere of their actualization will be the same. For this is also true of the things which are more evident to sense, i.e. of strength. It is produced by taking much food and undergoing much exertion, and it is the strong man that will be most able to do these things. All right, well, then he'll talk about the mean between two extremes and how it's not, when it comes to virtue, it's not the arithmetical mean between two extremes. It's the mean relative to you. What's too much food for some famous boxer? I mean, what, you know, that guy would eat, I forget what he says, you know, whatever, 10 pounds of food a day. That's way too much for the normal person, but not for him. For him, that's the mean between too much and not enough. So you have to take this idea of the golden mean and apply it individually to each individual person. All right, page 344 on the left. Again, the case of the arts and that of the virtues are not similar. All right, so in some cases, acquiring an art like flute playing and acquiring a virtue like courage are similar. You have to learn to be a flute player by playing the flute. You have to learn to be courageous by doing courageous deeds. But in other ways, they are not similar, for the products of the arts have their goodness in themselves. A good flute song is good. You can be a rapscallion of a human, but an excellent flute player, and your recording of a flute song is good in itself. But that's not the case with virtue. The courageous action isn't the goal, according to Aristotle. It's developing a courageous character. That's the goal of acting virtuously, not so much the deed that you do as the person you become by doing it. That's against utilitarianism. It's in a qualified way. Utilitarianism says an action is good if it promotes more happiness for more people, everyone considered. But we saw on page 338, John Stuart Mill said that, you know, there's a difference between a good action and the person who does the action. You could have, you know, even if the action fails and you don't produce happiness, the intentions of the person who did it still might be good. I discussed that in the video about comparing Mill to usually, no, it was to Kant. Yeah, Immanuel Kant. Okay, so at any rate, continuing here, 344, the agent also must be in a certain condition when he does them. This is the person who's trying to develop virtues. It's not just you did a virtuous act, but you have to be in a certain condition when you do it. In the first place, he must have knowledge. Secondly, he must choose the acts and choose them for their own sakes. And thirdly, his action must proceed from a firm and unchangeable character. Okay, a little bit lower there. Actions then are called just and temperate when they are such as the just or the temperate man would do. But it is not the man who does these that is just and temperate, but the man who also does them as just and temperate men do them. The point is, you can do a just act and yet not be a just person. Your motive for doing that act, which is just, might be unjust. So again, how do you become happy? You have to develop a good character. How do you develop a good character? Use the rational element of your soul to act virtuously, and virtue is the intermediate stage between two extremes of vice, one of excess, one of deficiency. Next paragraph on 344, the left column. But most people do not do these, but take refuge in theory, and think they are being philosophers, and will become good in this way, behaving somewhat like patients who listen attentively to their doctors, but do none of the things they are ordered to do. As the latter will not be made well in body by such a course of treatment, the former will not be made well in soul by such a course of philosophy. Okay, so, you know, I can't help but see myself a little bit in his accusation there. I read all these philosophers, but do I always apply the the postulates that they put forth, with which I agree. Absolutely, I do not. But I try. And this, again, ever since I was 18, it really stuck in my mind. Oh, wow, becoming a virtuous person is up to me. You just have to consistently do virtuous acts. Okay, so I am, here we go. On the right-hand column, 344. Thus a master of any art avoids excess and defect, but seeks the intermediate and chooses this, the intermediate not in the object, but relatively to us. It is thus, then, that every art does its work well by looking to the intermediate and judging its works by this standard, so that we often say of good works of art that it is not possible either to take away or to add anything, implying that excess and defect destroy the goodness of works of art, while the mean preserves it. And it's the same for developing virtue, he's going to say. For instance, both fear and confidence, and appetite and anger, and pity and in general pleasure and pain may be felt both too much and too little, and in both cases not well, but to feel them at the right times with reference to the right objects, toward the right people with the right motive, and in the right way, is what is both intermediate and best. And this is characteristic of virtue. Similarly, with regard to actions also, there is excess defect in the intermediate. Now, virtue is concerned with passions and actions. Next paragraph. But not every action or every passion admits of a mean, for some have names that already imply badness. For example, spite, shamelessness, envy, and in the case of actions, adultery, theft, and murder. They're never good. There's no intermediate between murder. Murder is inherently unjust. Killing is not. You can be courageous and kill somebody in battle, but that's not murder. Everyone on that battlefield knows the game. We're trying to kill each other. But if you just sneak up and kill somebody, that's not virtuous. So now the right-hand column, page 345, about halfway down. Hence also it is no easy task to be good, for in everything it is no easy task to find the middle. For example, to find the middle of a circle is not for everyone, but for him who knows. So, too, anyone can get angry. That is easy. Or give or spend money. But to do this at the right, to the right person, to the right extent, at the right time, with the right motive, and in the right way, that is not for everyone, nor is it easy. Wherefore, goodness is both rare and laudable and notable. Now, here's some more practical advice. He says, we must drag ourselves away to the contrary extreme, for we shall get into the intermediate state by drawing well aware from error. So if you have an inclination towards cowardice, then you should drag yourself away towards rashness, actually, because what appears to a coward to be rash would probably be more like actual courage, the mean. Extreme to you would be the mean. Or if you were too rash, okay, let me try to bend myself over towards cowardice, because what appears to be cowardice to a rash person is, again, probably closer to actual courage. A little bit of restraint, not leaping headlong without thinking things out first. So the final paragraph here, 345 to the right, so much then is plain that the intermediate state is in all things to be praised, but that we must incline sometimes towards the excess, sometimes towards the deficiency, for so shall we most easily hit the mean and what is right. Okay, now, how is that similar to Akan ethics? Well, as described by Kwame Gyekye, you'll see that it's almost identical, and he mentions Aristotle himself over on page 348 at the bottom of the right-hand column, as we'll see. But it's the same basic idea, develop virtues through habit. So on the left-hand column, 346, character in Akan ethics. This is from his essay, An Essay on African Philosophical Thought, from 1995. Morality is generally concerned with right and wrong conduct or behavior and good and bad character. We speak not only of a moral act, but also of a moral person. Skipping down a little bit. It is on the basis of a person's conduct that the Akans judge one to be good or bad, to have good character or bad character. According to them, the character of a person is basic. The performance of good or bad acts depends on the state of one's character, inasmuch as good deeds reflect good character. Character, Suban, appears as the focal point of the ethical life. So in parentheses, he put the word Suban. I went and I read online, and I'm hoping that I had it up here still. Where is it? Okay, here it is. So Kwame Gyekye, he wrote another article about Akan philosophy, and he talked about three fundamental terms: okra, or soul, which is immaterial; sunsum, which he translates as spirit; and honam, which is body. So then he talks about there's some confusion. Okra means soul, and honam means body, but sunsum, some people describe it as material, some people describe it as spiritual. He inclines towards thinking it's part of the soul. I think there's an intermediate position that you can see in Plato and in the Vedanta philosophy of a subtle material body. So you've got your soul, and then wrapped around the soul is your subtle material body of your mind, intelligence, and false ego. And then wrapped around that is the gross physical body made of the five elements: earth, water, fire, and air. Ether's the fifth element, the quintessence, which is this intermediary between material and spiritual. But at any rate, I thought that would help us understand a little bit more about Akan philosophy. Okay, so the right-hand column, page 346. For the Akans, and perhaps also for the Greeks and Arabs, ethics has to do principally with character. Ethics, according to Akan thinking, deals essentially with the quality of the individual's character. Skipping down a little bit, a man may know and may even accept a moral rule, such as, say, it is wrong to seduce someone's wife. But he may fail to apply this rule to a particular situation. He is not able to effect the transition from knowledge to action. According to the Akan thinkers, to be able to act in accord with the moral rules of the society requires the possession of good character, Suban. So again, this Suban, is it spiritual, is it material? Maybe it's subtle material. At any rate, what then is character? How do Akan thinkers define character? The root of Suban is su, or esu, meaning nature, which might imply that character is associated with a person's nature. That character develops from a set of inborn traits. All right, he's going to reject that idea. Overall, one might conclude that character is the state of or condition of the soul which causes it to perform its actions spontaneously and easily. He'll agree with that, but that easy, spontaneous activity comes through cultivating the appropriate habits. So this implies that the moral habits are innate, that we are born virtuous and are not responsible for our character. Again, he rejects that. The impression, however, is false. Despite its etymological link with nature, the Suban of a person is not wholly innate. I shall in due course explain what it means to say that the sunsum, the active aspect of the soul, plays a role in character formation. Akan thinkers define character in terms of habits, just like Aristotle, which originates from a person's deeds or actions. Character is the configuration of individual acts. Thus, several of my discussants, so he must have had this is an excerpt from a book, so he's talking about people he discussed Akan philosophy with. Several of my discussants opined that character is your deeds. All right, a little lower, he says, the thought here is that moral virtues arise through habituation, which is consonant with the empirical orientation of Akan philosophy. Aristotle also had an empirical orientation. Empirical, we learned earlier, there's the rationalists, there's the empiricists. The rationalists say you have innate forms of knowledge imprinted on your soul. Empiricists say you gain knowledge through your senses, through sense perception. I just want to make sure that this video is not conking out on me. Okay. So continuing here, he says, this, I think, is the reason for the teaching of moral values embedded in proverbs and folk tales to children in the process of their socialization. The moral instructions are meant to habituate them to moral virtues. If moral habits were thought to be acquired by nature or through birth, it would be senseless to pursue moral instruction. If you're born courageous, no one needs to teach you anything. You don't need to teach a spider how to spin a web. It has instinctive, innate knowledge how to do that. And yet, why do we spend so much time teaching children through these fables about proper behavior? Because it must indicate that we have to habituate ourselves to becoming virtuous. So continuing a little bit lower on 347, the left-hand column, to acquire virtue, a person must practice good deeds so that they become habitual. The newly acquired good habit must be strengthened by repetition. A single good deed may initiate further good deeds, And in this way, virtue is acquired. Over time, such an acquired virtue becomes a habit. This is the position of Akan philosophy, for this is what they mean by saying Aka ne ho. It is left or has remained with him. It has become part of him. It has become his habit. The emphasis placed by Akan thinkers on the influence of actions on character illustrates their conviction that one is in some sense responsible for the sort of person one is. The person is responsible for the state of his or her character. The unjust man may be held responsible for becoming unjust because his character is the result of repeated voluntary acts of injustice. So a little lower on the right-hand column, I'm going to skip. He's just reading some of other people who chime in on his opinion here. So the bottom of the right-hand column, the Akan position thus is that the original nature of human beings was morally neutral. If this were not the case, there would be no such thing as a moral person. The person's original moral neutrality later comes to be affected by actions, habits, responses to moral instruction, and so on. Consequently, what a person does or does not do is crucial in the formation of character. A virtuous character is the result of the performance of virtuous acts. So he's going over this again and again, just like Aristotle. But how are we to perform virtuous acts if we are not already virtuous? So remember, just because your action is virtuous doesn't mean you're a virtuous person. A scoundrel can do a good deed for some ulterior motive. So how do you do a virtuous act before you've developed the virtues? And then he'll go on to explain, if a person is not born virtuous, how can he or she perform virtuous acts? The answer is through moral instruction, which in traditional Akan society was normally done by means of ethical proverbs and folk tales. So moral instruction through proverbs and folk tales, through religious training as a youth, will teach you the right things to do. A child who behaves virtuously hasn't had time to develop those virtues. You couldn't say a child is virtuous really yet in any kind of a deep way. But a child can perform a virtuous act. If that child repeatedly performs virtuous acts, then that habit will become well entrenched, and now the child has developed into a virtuous adult. So the left-hand column, page 348, near the bottom, in dealing with the further question of how a person can perform such acts, the role of the sunsum in a person's psychological system must be recalled. It was observed earlier that a person's sunsum, spirit, plays a role in the formation and exercise of character, Suban, which means that sunsum, considered as a capacity, enables a person to perform virtuous acts. One might regard the position of the Akan traditional thinker here as less than adequate on the grounds that capacity or power does not exist in the same degree in different individuals. Okay, so this reminded me of reincarnation. For Plato, under whom Aristotle studied, there's a mortal soul, he says in the Timaeus, and the eternal soul, and then there's a gross physical body, just like in the Hindu philosophy of the Vishnu worshippers. And for them, Plato and the Vedanta philosophers, there's reincarnation, and it's your subtle mortal soul that carries your eternal soul from one gross physical body to the next. And it also carries over your predispositions of the previous life. If you develop virtues in one life, that's going to determine the kind of a body you get in the next life. That, I think, would help explain some of what, that Kwame Gyekye is going to talk about. Some people are born with a predisposition towards courage. We can't deny that. Some people are born with a predisposition towards different virtues, different vices. So how do you account for that if we're born morally neutral? It doesn't entirely seem that way. Plato and the Hindu philosophers would say, no, it's because you've developed through habit in your previous lives, which is carrying over. Your